We tell ourselves stories to make sense of the abyss. We frame suffering as a test of character, a crucible from which the worthy emerge, stronger. And when we see another fall, we whisper a different story, a story of weakness, of flawed moral fiber, of choices poorly made. It is a comforting narrative, because it keeps the abyss at a distance. It suggests the darkness is a place one chooses to enter, not a tide that can rise and swallow a home, a town, a nation. The story of heroin, the story of the opioid, is not that story. It is the other kind. The kind that reminds us that the line between patient and addict, between medicine and poison, between a world of manageable pain and a world of absolute surrender, is terrifyingly thin. It is a line drawn not in stone, but in smoke. You believe you understand it. You see the headlines, the hollowed-out faces in grainy news reports, the statistics that pile up like body counts from a distant, abstract war. You see a failure of will. A problem for other people, in other places. But the truth is a far more patient, far more intricate, and far more intimate predator. It began not in a back alley but in a field of flowers. It was cultivated not by criminals but by healers. And it was sold to us not as an escape, but as a promise, the most seductive promise of all, the end of pain. Before we descend into that promise, into the long, dark history of how a flower's dream became a generation's nightmare, I need you to do something. Put the world away. The distractions, the scrolling, the noise that keeps the quiet at bay. This story demands the quiet. It demands your undivided attention. Because the ghost of this story is in the architecture of our lives, in the medicine cabinets and the boardrooms and the forgotten towns that line the highways. So find a still moment. Set your phone face down. Turn the volume to a whisper. Let's go in. It begins, as so many things do, in the earth, a seed, a patient and silent vessel of immense potential, waiting for the precise alchemy of sunlight, soil, and water. From this seed unfurls the delicate, almost translucent stalk of Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bearing poppy. Before it is a vessel for anything else, for profit, for ruin, for geopolitical leverage, it is simply a flower, a thing of startling, ephemeral beauty. Its petals, thin as crushed silk, can be white, or pink, or a deep, bruised purple, and at their heart lies a crown of stamens surrounding a swollen, pale green ovary. This globe, the pod, is the plant's great work. It is a vault. And inside, it holds a kingdom of dreams. For millennia, this was a dream of healing. Humanity's first encounters with the poppy were not a dalliance with oblivion, but a desperate search for reprieve. In the Fertile Crescent, where civilization first drew breath, the Sumerians etched its likeness onto clay tablets nearly 6,000 years ago. They called it Hul Gil, the joy plant, a name that speaks not of manic euphoria, but of the profound, almost spiritual relief it offered in a world defined by brutish, unrelenting pain. In an era without anesthesia, without antibiotics, where a broken bone could be a death sentence and childbirth was a battle fought at the edge of the grave, the poppy was a miracle. The milky white latex that bled from its scored, unripened pod was a gift from the gods, a substance that could quiet a screaming nerve, soothe a fevered mind, and grant the grace of sleep to the dying. This was not a recreational dalliance, it was a fundamental pillar of medicine. The knowledge of its power traveled on the slow, dust-choked currents of ancient trade. The Egyptians, masters of medicine and ritual, codified its use in their most sacred medical texts, the Ebers Papyrus, prescribing it for everything from crying infants to unspecified internal ailments. They placed opium poppies in the tombs of their pharaohs, a final offering of peace for the journey into the afterlife. The Greeks, who gave us the foundation of Western thought, also gave the substance its name, opium, derived from their word for juice. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, championed its use, albeit with a physician's caution, recognizing its dual nature. It was a pharmakon, the ancient Greek word for a substance that could be both remedy and poison, a concept we have spent the subsequent 2,500 years failing to fully grasp. In the hands of a healer, it was the balm of Asclepius, the god of medicine. In the wrong hands, or in the wrong dose, it was a quiet poison, a gentle slide into the arms of Morpheus, the god of dreams, and his brother, Thanatos, the god of death. Even the Roman Empire, that great engine of conquest and commerce, ran on the poppy's power. Legionaries carried it in their medical kits to treat the grievous wounds of the battlefield, and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher king, famously drank a preparation of opium every evening to manage his chronic pain and find the rest needed to rule an empire. Throughout these centuries, the relationship was one of respect, bordering on reverence. Opium was a powerful spirit to be communed with, not a substance to be conquered. It was almost always consumed orally, mixed with wine or water, a method that ensured a slow, gradual absorption into the body. This inherent limitation of biology acted as a natural brake. The body could only process so much at once, and the full, overwhelming force of the plant's alkaloids was blunted, diffused through the slow process of digestion. It was a potent medicine, certainly, but it was not yet a monster. The poppy's dream was still a gentle one, a tool used to mediate the harsh realities of existence. It was a covenant between humanity and the natural world, a bargain struck for a measure of peace. But the seeds of a darker future were already being sown, not in the poppy fields of Anatolia, but in the burgeoning curiosity of the human mind. A new kind of thinking was taking root, one that was not content with the gifts of nature as they were. It sought to understand, to deconstruct, to isolate, and to improve. It was the dawn of alchemy, the precursor to chemistry, and it looked upon the raw, complex substance of opium not as a holistic miracle, but as a puzzle to be solved, a vault to be cracked open. And what lay inside that vault, once unlocked from its natural constraints, would be a power far greater and far more terrible than any ancient civilization could have ever imagined. The poppy was waiting. It had always been waiting. For the right mind, the right tool, and the right moment of human hubris to unleash its true, undiluted heart upon the world. The age of reverence was ending. The age of refinement was about to begin. The slow, methodical rhythm of history, which had for millennia governed humanity's relationship with the poppy, began to accelerate with the relentless ticking of the scientific mind. The Enlightenment had cast its long, illuminating shadow across Europe, replacing ancient reverence with a new, insatiable hunger for dissection and discovery. Nature was no longer a realm of spirits and gods to be appeased, but a vast, intricate machine to be taken apart, its gears and levers catalogued and, ultimately, controlled. It was in this crucible of empirical fervor that the poppy's secret heart was finally laid bare. The year was 1804. In a small, unassuming apothecary in Paderborn, Germany, a young, brilliant, and obsessively driven pharmacist's assistant named Friedrich Serturner was growing frustrated. He was a man possessed by a single, powerful idea, that the unpredictable, often toxic nature of raw opium was not an inherent property of the plant itself, but a problem of its impurity. He believed that within the gummy, brown resin lay a single, hidden principle, a pure essence responsible for its profound analgesic and soporific effects. If he could only isolate this principium somniferum, this sleep-inducing principle, he could create a medicine of unparalleled purity, consistency, and power, a perfect weapon against pain. For years, he toiled in obscurity, conducting countless experiments with dangerous chemicals and crude laboratory equipment. He dissolved opium in acid, neutralized it with ammonia, and painstakingly precipitated out the crystals that formed. The result was a yellowish-white, crystalline powder, an alkaloid he had successfully wrested from its complex natural matrix. To test its potency, he first administered it to stray dogs, watching with a scientist's detached fascination as they fell into a deep, unnervingly profound slumber. But the true test would require a human subject. In an act of radical self-experimentation that bordered on suicidal, Serturner and 3 of his young friends each ingested a dose of the new substance, a dose far larger than he had anticipated. The effects were terrifyingly immediate. They were plunged into a violent, death-like sleep, a coma from which they only awoke hours later through the desperate administration of vinegar, a powerful emetic. They had stared into the abyss, but they had returned. And Serturner knew he had found it. He had unlocked the poppy's soul. In honor of Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, he named his creation Morphium, which would later be known to the world as morphine. This was not merely a discovery, it was a fundamental transfiguration. Morphine was to opium as a rifle bullet is to a thrown stone. By isolating the active alkaloid, Sir Turner had concentrated its power tenfold, creating a substance that could bypass the body's natural defenses with shocking efficiency. The era of gently sipping opium-laced wine was over. The age of the pure, unadulterated chemical had begun. Yet, for several decades, morphine remained something of a medical curiosity, its full potential, and its full horror, still constrained by the limitations of its delivery. But then, in the middle of the 19th century, two inventions converged to change everything. First, in 1853, the Scottish physician Alexander would develop the first true hypodermic syringe, a fine, hollow needle attached to a plunger that could deliver a drug directly into the bloodstream. It was a medical marvel, allowing for the precise, rapid administration of medicine. When this needle was filled with a solution of morphine, the alchemist's curse was complete. The final barrier between the drug and the human nervous system, the slow, mediating process of digestion, was obliterated. Now, the full, thunderous force of the poppy's concentrated essence could be mainlined directly into the brain, delivering a wave of euphoria and pain relief so immediate, so absolute, that it felt like a divine revelation. The stage was now set for the first great modern plague of addiction. The catalyst arrived with the roar of cannons and the screams of the wounded. The American Civil War, a conflict of unprecedented industrial-scale slaughter, became the crucible in which morphine addiction was forged. On battlefields from Gettysburg to Antietam, field surgeons armed with newly issued hypodermic kits administered morphine liberally to soldiers with shattered limbs and gaping wounds. It was a miracle drug, the GOM or God's own medicine, as the soldiers called it. It allowed men to endure amputations without anesthetic and to survive injuries that would have previously meant a slow, agonizing death from shock and pain. But when the guns fell silent and the survivors limped home, they brought with them a new, invisible wound. An entire generation of veterans, heralded as heroes, were now hopelessly dependent on the needle. The condition became so widespread it was given a name, that a soldier's disease. It was a quiet epidemic, hidden behind the closed doors of respectable homes, a source of private shame for families who could not understand how their brave sons and husbands had returned from the war only to be enslaved by their medicine. Sir Turner, in his quest for a perfect painkiller, had unknowingly uncaged a demon. He had sought to purify a remedy, but in doing so, he had perfected a poison. The poppy's dream, once a gentle whisper of relief, was now, thanks to the twin engines of scientific hubris and industrial warfare, a siren song with the power to capture and consume the soul. The world would learn, slowly and painfully, that a dream made too pure, too powerful, and too direct, inevitably becomes a nightmare. The late 19th century was an age of boundless optimism, a time when science and industry promised to solve all of humanity's ancient ills. In this gilded age of invention, progress was not just a goal, it was a religion. Laboratories and factories hummed with the creation of new wonders, from the electric light bulb to the automobile. And within this landscape of fervent innovation, the world of medicine was no exception. The lingering problem of the soldier's disease, the widespread morphine addiction that was the dark legacy of the Civil War, was seen not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of potent opioids, but as another puzzle to be solved by the relentless march of chemistry. The prevailing belief was that morphine's addictive properties were a flaw, a side effect that could be engineered away. What was needed was a new molecule, a substance that possessed all of morphine's miraculous pain-killing power without its ruinous capacity for dependence. It was a search for the ultimate prize, a non-addictive morphine. And it was in the state-of-the-art industrial laboratories of the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in Elberfeld, Germany, that this search would reach its catastrophic conclusion. In 1897, a chemist named Felix Hoffmann, the same man credited with synthesizing aspirin just days earlier, was experimenting with the acetylation of morphine. By boiling morphine with acetic anhydride, a chemical cousin to vinegar, he created a new compound, diacetylmorphine. It was a fine, white, crystalline powder, and initial tests on laboratory animals were astonishing. It appeared to be a far more potent respiratory suppressant and painkiller than morphine, and, crucially, the initial, flawed observation suggested it produced less nausea and, they incorrectly presumed, less dependency. The company's head of pharmacology, Heinrich Draeser, presented these findings at a medical conference, championing the new substance with an almost evangelical zeal. He claimed it was a miracle, a wonder drug that was not only a powerful analgesic but also an astoundingly effective cough suppressant, 10 times more powerful than codeine. Most importantly, he declared it to be the cure for morphine addiction itself. The logic, however perverse it seems in retrospect, was that this new, safer, compound could be used to wean addicts off morphine. Bayer needed a name for this revolutionary product, a name that would capture its magnificent power and its supposedly heroic purpose. They called it heroin. The marketing campaign that followed was one of the most successful, and most tragic, in the history of commerce. Bayer launched heroin onto the global market in 1898, not as a restricted, dangerous narcotic, but as an over-the-counter panacea. It was sold in pill and elixir form in pharmacies from London to New York to Shanghai. Advertisements in medical journals and newspapers depicted heroin as a brave, conquering hero, vanquishing the twin dragons of pain and coughs. It was promoted as a treatment for everything from the common cold, bronchitis, and asthma to the terminal stages of tuberculosis. Perhaps most chillingly, it was marketed as being perfectly safe for children. Bayer produced cough syrups containing heroin, packaged with images of happy, healthy families, promising a quiet night's sleep for infants suffering from colic or a nagging cough. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed as though science had finally triumphed. Doctors prescribed it enthusiastically, and patients embraced it, marveling at its rapid, profound effects. The world welcomed this white powder into its homes, into its medicine cabinets, and into the very bodies of its children, believing it to be a benevolent friend, a heroic rescuer sent by the gods of modern science. But the poppy's ghost, now twice distilled and chemically perfected, could not be so easily tamed. The very properties that made heroin so effective were the keys to its insidious power. The acetylation process had made the molecule more fat-soluble, allowing it to cross the blood-brain barrier with breathtaking speed. Once inside the brain, it converted back into morphine, but the speed of its arrival produced a euphoric rush of an intensity that morphine alone could not match. It was this rush, this instantaneous, overwhelming wave of warmth and bliss, that made it exponentially more addictive than its predecessor. The promise of a cure for morphine addiction was not just a lie, it was a cruel joke. Giving heroin to a morphine addict was like trying to extinguish a fire with gasoline. Within a few short years, the devastating truth began to surface. Reports flooded in from doctors and hospitals around the world, describing patients who had been prescribed heroin for a simple cough and had rapidly developed a ferocious, intractable addiction. The cure had become a new, more virulent disease. The would-be hero had revealed itself to be a monster of unparalleled destructive force, a Trojan horse that had been willingly pulled through the gates of the city, celebrated as a gift while concealing an army of ruin within its belly. The first international attempts to control the substance began, but it was too late. The secret was out. The alchemist's dream had been bottled, branded, and sold to the masses. And now, as the doors of legitimate medicine slowly began to swing shut, heroin did not disappear. It simply slipped out the back door, into the shadows, where it would find a new and even more fertile kingdom to conquer, the hidden, desperate veins of the modern city. As the 20th century dawned, the golden age of heroin as a celebrated, mainstream medicine came to an abrupt and decisive end. The horrifying truth of its addictive power could no longer be ignored or explained away by its corporate creators. A wave of public panic and moral outrage, fanned by lurid newspaper stories of dope fiends and ruined lives, swept across the Western world. Governments, once complicit in the drug's proliferation, were now forced to act. In the United States, this shift was codified by the passage of the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914. On its surface, the law was a piece of regulatory tax legislation, requiring those who prescribed or distributed narcotics like cocaine and opiates to register with the federal government and pay a small tax. But its enforcement and subsequent judicial interpretations transformed it into a tool of outright prohibition. Doctors who prescribed opiates to maintain an addict's habit, the only effective treatment known at the time, were prosecuted, their medical licenses revoked, and some were even imprisoned. The medical profession, fearing federal retribution, abandoned the addict. The door to the clinic was slammed shut, locked, and bolted. This act of prohibition did not, of course, eradicate the demand for heroin. It simply performed a great and terrible act of transubstantiation. It transformed the addict from a patient into a criminal, and the drug from a medicine into contraband. In doing so, it pushed the entire ecosystem of opiate use out of the light and into the underworld. Heroin, now an outlaw, became a new kind of commodity, its value determined not by pharmaceutical companies but by the ruthless calculus of risk and reward that governs all black markets. A new kind of entrepreneur emerged to meet the still insatiable demand, the organized criminal. The drug trade became a foundational pillar for the burgeoning American mafia, a source of immense, untaxable profit that fueled their rise to power. The supply chain that was once managed by pharmacists in white coats was now controlled by gangsters in fedoras. The substance, which had once traveled in clean, labeled bottles, now moved through a clandestine network of smugglers, pushers, and street corner dealers, its purity and safety subject to no oversight whatsoever. The geography of heroin use shifted as well. It migrated from the respectable family medicine cabinet to the dark, vibrant, and marginalized corners of the urban landscape. It found a home in the jazz clubs of Harlem and the flophouses of the Bowery, in the port cities where smugglers could easily bring it ashore, and in the forgotten, impoverished neighborhoods where hope was in short supply. It became intertwined with the burgeoning countercultures of the era, a symbol of rebellion and a tool for self-medication against the pain of poverty, racism, and societal alienation. For the jazz musicians who created America's most original art form, it offered a temporary escape from the grueling demands of the road and the sting of segregation. For the dispossessed and the downtrodden, it offered a brief, warm oblivion, a fleeting respite from a world that had offered them little else. The ritual of its use changed, becoming more desperate and more dangerous. The preferred method of administration shifted from oral ingestion or sniffing to intravenous injection, mainlining, a practice that delivered the drug's euphoric rush with maximum speed and intensity, but which also carried with it the new dangers of overdose, collapsed veins, and blood-borne diseases like hepatitis. The needle, once a symbol of modern medical progress, became a sigil of the underworld, a tool of a dark and secret sacrament. A hidden nation was forming within the nation, a parallel society with its own language, its own economy, and its own brutal set of laws. It was a world of junks, dealers, fixes, and cold turkey. A life in this world was a life reduced to a single, relentless cycle, the desperate, all-consuming hunt for money, through petty crime, prostitution, or any means necessary, followed by the brief, ecstatic relief of the fix, which was itself merely the prelude to the creeping dread of withdrawal and the beginning of the next hunt. This was the world that William S. Burroughs would later document with such hallucinatory, nightmarish clarity, a world of naked lunch, where one sees what is on the end of every fork. Heroin had carved out its kingdom in the shadows, a kingdom built on pain and sustained by profit. It had become a force of social gravity, pulling the vulnerable and the marginalized into its orbit, while the rest of society looked away, content to believe that the problem had been solved, that the monster had been locked away in the ghetto, far from their own clean, respectable lives. But the monster was not contained. It was merely consolidating its power, sinking its roots deep into the foundations of the city, and waiting. Waiting for the currents of global conflict and political cynicism to open up new highways, new channels through which its influence could flow, flooding not just the hidden corners of the city, but the entire world. The Second World War redrew the map of the world, and in its chaotic aftermath, new empires of influence rose from the ashes of the old. The ensuing Cold War was not a conflict fought on traditional battlefields, but in the shadows, a global chess match played by superpowers through proxy wars, covert operations, and cynical alliances. In this new world order, the flow of illicit narcotics became more than just a matter of crime and addiction, it became a tool of geopolitics, a hidden stream of revenue used to fund armies, topple governments, and prop up friendly regimes. The poppy, which had once been a subject of medicine and then of domestic law enforcement, now became a pawn in the great game of nations. And as the focus of this game shifted to Southeast Asia, a region of dense jungles, rugged mountains, and porous borders, a new, terrifyingly prolific source of heroin was about to be unleashed upon the world. This was the Golden Triangle, the vast, lawless region where the borders of Burma, Thailand, and Laos converge, a place whose climate and isolation made it the most perfect poppy-growing territory on Earth. For decades, the global heroin supply had been dominated by opium from Turkey and the Middle East, which was refined in clandestine labs in Marseille, France, and smuggled into the United States, the infamous French Connection, but this network was about to be supplanted by a far larger and more efficient pipeline, one lubricated by the exigencies of Cold War strategy. As Mao Zedong's communists consolidated their power in China in 1949, remnants of the defeated Kuomintang, KMT, army fled south into the Shan state of Burma. Stranded and without resources, they turned to the region's most lucrative cash crop, opium. The Central Intelligence Agency, in its single-minded crusade against the spread of communism, saw these KMT remnants as a valuable anti-communist buffer force. The CIA allegedly provided the KMT with weapons, training, and logistical support, turning a blind eye to, and in some accounts, actively facilitating, their burgeoning opium trade as a means of self-financing. The agency's proprietary airline, Air America, which flew covert missions throughout the region, was often accused of transporting not just soldiers and supplies, but raw opium as well. In the name of fighting one perceived evil, American foreign policy helped to cultivate another, far more insidious one. The Golden Triangle was transformed into a veritable narco-state, an industrial-scale producer of opium that dwarfed all previous sources. Local warlords, empowered by their role in the drug trade and their alliances with foreign intelligence agencies, carved out personal fiefdoms, commanding private armies and overseeing a vast network of poppy fields and heroin refineries. The poppy's dream had become a geopolitical weapon, its profits fueling a shadow war. This immense new supply of heroin needed a market, and it would find one in the most tragic and ironic of places, among the young American soldiers sent to fight and die in the jungles of Vietnam. The Vietnam War was a new kind of hell, a brutal, disorienting conflict with no clear front lines and no obvious purpose. For the hundreds of thousands of young GIs plunged into this crucible of fear, boredom, and trauma, heroin offered a potent escape. But this was not the heavily diluted, expensive street heroin they might have known back home. This was China White, a product of the Golden Triangle's refineries that was astonishingly pure, often over 95% diacetylmorphine, and dirt cheap. It was so potent that it didn't need to be injected, it could be smoked or snorted, removing the psychological barrier and the stigma of the needle. The drug flooded the American bases and the streets of Saigon. It was easier to score a vial of pure heroin than a pack of American cigarettes. The consequences were catastrophic. An epidemic of addiction swept through the ranks of the U.S. military. Official estimates, likely conservative, suggested that as many as 15 to 20% of enlisted men in Vietnam became addicted to heroin. It was a silent, internal collapse, a hollowing out of morale and discipline that military command seemed powerless to stop. When these soldiers finally returned home, they brought the war with them, not just in their minds, in the form of post-traumatic stress, but in their blood. They were a new generation of the soldier's disease, but on a scale that dwarfed the aftermath of the Civil War. They returned to a nation that did not understand their sacrifice and was ill-equipped to deal with their invisible wounds. The Veterans Administration was overwhelmed, and treatment options were scarce and often ineffective. These addicted veterans, along with the vast, established smuggling routes and connections forged during the war, created a perfect storm. The Golden Triangle's heroin, which had followed the soldiers home, now flooded American cities, bringing with it a new wave of addiction, crime, and despair that would plague the nation for decades to come. The cynical calculations of Cold War realpolitik, played out in the distant jungles of Asia, had come home to roost. The shadow of the Golden Triangle now stretched halfway across the world, falling darkly across the streets of America. While the currents of global geopolitics were creating an unprecedented supply of heroin from abroad, a slower, more insidious decay was taking hold within the very heartland of America. A deep, structural transformation was reshaping the nation's economic and social landscape, creating a fertile ground of despair where the seeds of addiction could take root and flourish on a scale never before seen. This was the long, painful death of the American industrial age, a process that began in the 1970s and accelerated through the end of the century. The great engines of American prosperity, the steel mills, the coal mines, the auto plants, the factories that had built the middle class and won world wars, began to fall silent. One by one, they shuttered their gates, rusted, and crumbled, leaving behind a profound and echoing emptiness. This was the birth of the Rust Belt, a name that perfectly captured the sense of corrosion and abandonment that settled over vast swaths of the Midwest and Appalachia. For generations, life in these towns had been governed by a powerful, implicit social contract. You worked hard, often in grueling, physically demanding jobs, but in return, you received a steady paycheck, a pension, healthcare, and the pride of building something tangible. You could buy a home, raise a family, and believe that your children would have a better life than you did. It was a life of dignity, community, and purpose, centered around the plant or the mine. When that central pillar collapsed, the entire structure of society came crashing down with it. Globalization and automation, the twin forces of late 20th century capitalism, had rendered these communities obsolete. The jobs didn't just temporarily disappear in a recession, they vanished forever, outsourced to cheaper labor markets overseas or replaced by machines that didn't need pensions or bathroom breaks. The towns they had sustained were left adrift. The tax base evaporated, schools closed, storefronts were boarded up, and a generation of men who had been taught that their value was tied to their labor were suddenly told they had no value at all. What followed was not just economic hardship, but a deep spiritual and existential crisis. The loss was not merely of income, but of identity. A profound sense of betrayal took hold, a feeling that the system they had believed in and fought for had discarded them like a broken tool. This economic despair was compounded by a more literal, physical pain. Decades of hard, repetitive, and often dangerous manual labor had taken a brutal toll on the bodies of the populace. Men and women in their 40s and 50s were living with the chronic pain of bad backs, ruined knees, and black lung disease. They were a population in pain, both physical and psychic, a population whose suffering was largely invisible to the thriving coastal economies that were benefiting from the new globalized world order. They were the forgotten people in the flyover states, their plight a footnote in the triumphant narrative of post-industrial progress. A quiet desperation settled over these hollowed-out communities. Rates of depression, suicide, and alcoholism began to climb. The strong communal bonds that had once held these towns together frayed as people moved away in search of work, leaving behind an aging population and a generation of young people with no future to look forward to. The American dream, for them, had become a hollow echo. This landscape of multi-generational, systemic despair was a tinderbox, waiting for a spark. It was a vacuum of hope, and nature, in its social as well as its physical forms, abhors a vacuum. Something had to rush in to fill the void, to numb the pain, to offer some form of temporary relief from a reality that had become unbearable. For a time, it was alcohol, or methamphetamines, or black market prescription pills. But a new and far more powerful force was gathering on the horizon, one that would be delivered not by a street corner dealer, but by a figure of unimpeachable trust and authority. The coming plague would not arrive in a smuggler's suitcase or a dealer's balloon. It would arrive in a legitimate, FDA-approved bottle, with a child-proof cap and a label bearing the patient's own name. The pharmaceutical industry, armed with a new product and a revolutionary marketing strategy, was about to look upon this vast reservoir of American pain and see not a tragedy, but the greatest commercial opportunity in its history. The stage was perfectly set. The characters were all in place, a population in chronic pain, a generation stripped of purpose, and a medical system that was about to be convinced that the answer to all this suffering could be found in a simple prescription. The hollow echo of the Rust Belt was about to be filled with the poppy's deadliest whisper. In the final decade of the 20th century, a subtle but revolutionary shift occurred within the halls of American medicine. It was a quiet coup, not of scalpels and sutures, but of philosophy and language. It began with a compassionate, well-intentioned premise, that the medical establishment was failing to adequately treat pain. Patient advocacy groups and influential pain specialists argued, correctly, that for too long, doctors had been overly cautious in prescribing opioid painkillers, allowing millions of Americans to suffer needlessly from chronic conditions, post-surgical pain, and terminal illnesses. A new mantra began to take hold: pain was being undertreated. This compassionate impulse was codified in 1996 when the American Pain Society introduced the concept of pain as the fifth vital sign, urging doctors to assess and record a patient's pain level with the same diligence as they did blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, and respiration. On its face, it was a humane evolution in patient care. But it inadvertently created a system that pressured doctors to eliminate pain at all costs, and it opened the door for a predator that had been waiting patiently in the wings. That predator was Purdue Pharma, a then obscure, privately owned pharmaceutical company run by the Sackler family. In 1996, the same year pain became the fifth vital sign, Purdue introduced a new drug to the market, OxyContin. The drug itself was not new. Its active ingredient, oxycodone, was a semi-synthetic opioid that had been around since 1917 and was known to be highly addictive. Purdue's innovation was not chemical, but mechanical. They formulated the oxycodone into a pill with a patented time-release mechanism, a coating called Contin that was designed to dissolve slowly, releasing the drug over a 12-hour period. This, Purdue claimed, was the key to its revolutionary nature. By eliminating the peaks and valleys of immediate-release painkillers, OxyContin would provide smooth, continuous pain relief. And this, they argued in a marketing leap of faith that would prove to be catastrophic, made the drug uniquely safe from abuse and addiction. Their central, oft-repeated claim, a claim that would become the cornerstone of a multi-billion-dollar marketing blitz, was that the risk of addiction from OxyContin was less than 1%. This claim was not based on any rigorous, long-term clinical studies. It was a dangerously misleading cherry-picking of data, but it was exactly what the medical community, now primed to treat pain more aggressively, wanted to hear. Purdue Pharma weaponized this message with a sales and marketing strategy of unprecedented scale and sophistication. They assembled a massive army of sales representatives, incentivized with enormous bonuses, and sent them out to target not just pain specialists, but general practitioners in every corner of the country, especially in those regions, like Appalachia and the Rust Belt, where rates of workplace injuries and chronic pain were highest. They armed their sales force with a deluge of branded swag, fishing hats, coffee mugs, plush toys, and a library of glossy, reassuring promotional materials. They funded thousands of all-expenses-paid pain management seminars for doctors at luxurious resorts, where paid medical speakers, presented as independent experts, delivered talks that echoed Purdue's marketing points about the safety and efficacy of OxyContin. They placed slick, full-page ads in the most respected medical journals. The message was simple, seductive, and relentless. OxyContin was a miracle, a non-addictive opioid that could be prescribed for a vast range of common ailments, from back pain and arthritis to fibromyalgia. The era of opiophobia, they declared, was over. Doctors, acting in what they believed to be the best interests of their suffering patients, began prescribing OxyContin with breathtaking enthusiasm. Prescriptions skyrocketed, from around 670,000 in 1997 to over 62 million by 2002. Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family became billionaires. But in the small towns and hollows where the pills were flowing most freely, a nightmare was unfolding. The less than 1% claim was a catastrophic lie. Patients prescribed the drug for routine injuries found themselves powerfully, inexplicably dependent, their bodies screaming for the medication when their prescriptions ran out. Furthermore, the vaunted time-release mechanism, the very feature that was supposed to make the drug safe, was easily defeated. Users quickly discovered that by simply crushing the pill and snorting or injecting the powder, they could bypass the coating and deliver the entire 12-hour dose of pure, potent oxycodone directly to the brain, producing a euphoric rush that was nearly identical to that of heroin. A new culture of abuse exploded. OxyContin became known on the street as hillbilly heroin. Pharmacies were robbed at gunpoint. So-called pill mills, corrupt pain clinics where doctors wrote thousands of prescriptions for cash, sprang up throughout the country. An entire generation, which had been promised relief from their pain by the trusted figures of modern medicine, had been delivered directly into the jaws of a ferocious addiction. The white-coated push had been a staggering success. The poppy, in its newest, most respectable guise, had been welcomed into the heart of the community, prescribed by a trusted doctor and paid for by health insurance. And it was about to exact a price that would be measured in an ocean of ruined lives and a generation of the dead. The dam had broken. The massive, unprecedented wave of opioid prescriptions that began in the late 1990s did not just create a public health crisis, it fundamentally re-engineered the landscape of addiction in America. For the first time in history, the primary gateway to a powerful opiate addiction was not a street corner dealer, but a physician's prescription pad. Millions of people from every walk of life, factory workers, stay-at-home mothers, high school athletes, grandparents, were led down a path to dependency by a system they had been taught to trust. This initial phase of the epidemic, driven by pills like OxyContin, Vicodin, and Percocet, created a vast, nationwide reservoir of individuals whose brains and bodies had been hijacked by a daily, medically sanctioned need for opioids. But this state of affairs, with its easy access and legitimate supply, was not destined to last. As the death toll mounted and the true scale of the crisis became impossible to ignore, a slow, belated crackdown began. Law enforcement agencies started raiding pill mills. State governments implemented prescription drug monitoring programs to track patients and doctors. The media, which had been slow to recognize the story, began to sound the alarm. Purdue Pharma itself, facing a deluge of lawsuits, reformulated OxyContin in 2010 to make it more difficult to crush and abuse. These measures, while necessary, had a devastating and unforeseen consequence. They did not cure the millions who were already addicted, they simply cut them off from their supply. An entire population, now physically and psychologically dependent on a daily dose of opioids to function and to stave off the hell of withdrawal, was suddenly abandoned. They were left in a state of profound desperation, a desperation that the black market is always perfectly poised to exploit. And waiting for them in the shadows was the poppy's older, more notorious child, heroin. The iron laws of economics took over. As prescription pills became scarcer and more expensive on the street, a flood of cheap, potent heroin from Mexico and South America poured across the border to meet the new demand. For an addict who might have to pay $80 for a single 80mg OxyContin pill, a bag of heroin that delivered a more powerful high could be purchased for as little as $5 or $10. The choice, for someone in the grips of addiction, was no choice at all. A great and tragic migration began, as hundreds of thousands of people who had started their journey in a doctor's office made the final, desperate leap to the needle and the street corner. The face of the heroin user in America changed. It was no longer confined to the inner-city jazz clubs or the scarred arms of Vietnam veterans. It was now the face of the high school cheerleader from the suburbs, the laid-off factory worker from Ohio, the farmer from rural Vermont. This transition from pills to heroin marked a terrifying escalation of the crisis. Street heroin was a product of a violent, unregulated market. Its purity was wildly inconsistent, and its price was lethally low. The risk of overdose, already high, became astronomical. And just as this new, expanded market for heroin reached its peak, an even more sinister chemical ghost appeared on the scene. This was fentanyl, a synthetic opioid, first synthesized in 1959, that is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. Developed for use as a surgical anesthetic and for managing severe pain in cancer patients, its sheer power made it an irresistible adulterant for drug traffickers. By mixing a small, inexpensive amount of illicitly manufactured fentanyl into a batch of heroin, dealers could dramatically increase its potency and their profit margins. For the user, this was a deadly game of Russian roulette. A dose of heroin that they might have handled the day before could, the very next day, be laced with a lethal hotspot of fentanyl. The difference between the high they were chasing and a fatal overdose was now measured in micrograms, a quantity invisible to the naked eye. The death toll, which had already been climbing steadily for a decade, exploded. Overdose became the leading cause of accidental death in the United States, surpassing car crashes and gun violence. It was a silent, rolling plague, hollowing out communities from the inside. First responders, armed with the overdose-reversing drug naloxone, found themselves reviving the same people over and over again, fighting a losing battle against a tide of chemical despair. Families were shattered, their savings drained by expensive, often ineffective rehab programs. The foster care system was overwhelmed with the children of addicted parents. The morgues ran out of space. The prescription cascade had run its terrible, logical course. The well-intentioned but misguided campaign to eliminate pain, exploited by corporate greed, had created a generation of addicts. The crackdown on that supply had pushed them into the arms of the cartels. And the cartels, in their relentless pursuit of profit, had introduced a poison of unimaginable lethality. All the threads of the story, the ancient poppy, the chemist's hubris, the soldier's trauma, the Rust Belt's decay, the Sackler family's ambition, and the politician's neglect, had converged into a single, fatal point, the tip of a needle filled with a substance born in a flower field and perfected in a clandestine lab, delivering not a dream, but a final, quiet, and absolute stillness. The wreckage is all around us now, a landscape of quiet devastation that has become so commonplace it risks becoming invisible. The numbers, in their sheer scale, defy easy comprehension, numbing the mind to the human reality they represent. Hundreds of thousands dead from overdoses since the turn of the century. Millions more living in the perpetual twilight of active addiction. A generation of children growing up in the foster care system or raised by grandparents, their family structures shattered by the chemical ghost. The cost is measured not only in coroner's reports and emergency room visits, but in lost productivity, in the hollowing out of local economies, and in the erosion of the very fabric of community in towns across the nation. We are living in the aftermath, sifting through the debris of a catastrophe that was decades in the making, a slow-motion disaster born from a confluence of greed, neglect, and a profound, tragically American misunderstanding of the nature of pain. Reflecting on the long, winding path that led us here is to trace a map of cascading failures, each one compounding the last. It is a story of hubris, the hubris of the chemist who believed he could distill a plant's soul without consequence, the hubris of the pharmaceutical company that believed it could brand a demon as a hero and sell it to the masses, the hubris of a medical system that believed the complexities of human suffering could be solved with a pill. It is a story of greed, the cold, sociopathic calculus of a corporation that knowingly pushed a dangerously addictive product onto a vulnerable population, prioritizing profit margins over human lives. And it is a story of neglect, the neglect of a society that turned its back on its deindustrialized heartland, leaving communities to rot in economic despair, and the neglect of a political system that for too long chose to criminalize addiction rather than treat it as the public health crisis it has always been. We tried to declare war on a chemical, when the real war was always against the pain that drove people to it in the first place, the pain of a body broken by labor, the pain of a spirit crushed by hopelessness, the pain of a soul alienated from a sense of purpose. The thematic closure of this story, if one can even be found, is a somber and deeply unsettling one. It is the realization that our relentless quest to conquer pain, to eliminate it from the human experience entirely, has paradoxically created a new and more profound form of suffering. The poppy first offered its dream as a gentle reprieve, a temporary shelter from the harshness of the world. But we were not content with that. We refined it, concentrated it, marketed it, and commodified it, transforming a natural bomb into an absolute weapon. We sought a shortcut to deliverance, and in doing so, we paved a highway to hell. The story of heroin and the opioids is a dark mirror held up to our civilization, reflecting our deepest vulnerabilities and our most catastrophic flaws. It reveals our tendency to seek simple solutions for complex problems, our susceptibility to the siren song of profit, and our tragic failure to care for the most vulnerable among us. There is no neat resolution here, no tidy ending where the heroes prevail and the monster is slain. The monster is not a single entity to be vanquished. It is a complex, symbiotic organism woven into the very fabric of our society, into our healthcare system, our economy, and our culture. The Sacklers have faced lawsuits, and Purdue Pharma has declared bankruptcy, but the damage is done, and the forces they unleashed are now self-sustaining. The illicit fentanyl continues to pour across the borders, evolving into new and even deadlier forms. The generation lost to the plague cannot be brought back. And the underlying conditions of despair, inequality, and untreated trauma that created the fertile ground for this crisis remain largely unaddressed. The story is not over. It continues in the quiet desperation of a pharmacy waiting line, in the frantic blue lights of an ambulance cutting through the night, in the hollowed-out eyes of a parent who has just buried a child. The poppy fields are still growing, swaying gently in the wind under a distant sun, indifferent to the chaos they have wrought. They are patient. They hold their ancient dream within their swollen pods, a dream of peace and of oblivion, waiting for the next chapter in humanity's long, painful, and unfinished struggle with itself. The air grows still. The story fades, but the silence it leaves behind is heavy, and it is listening.